We'll be talking about open primaries, Amendment H. On our ballot this year, we're going to have a bunch of different questions. Amendment H is one of them. So before we jump in here, just the 30-second overview of the organization I work for. It's called the South Dakota Family Voice. We're equipping people to stand up for parental rights, religious liberty, education options, sanctity of life, and more. And we do it in 3 ways. We're helping people stay informed on the controversial issues of the day, make their voice heard in the halls of government, and elect strong people who will represent us well. So that's the 30-second elevator speech of what I do in my day job, but today we're going to talk about Amendment H. We're going to cover 3 things: the background and details of the landscape here in South Dakota, the pro-arguments for passing it, and the con-arguments against it. Those are the 3 main buckets. So we'll start with just the landscape and the details. We're all familiar with this process. You've got a Republican primary, you've got a Democrat primary. They each appoint people for the general election. Pretty simple. There's a few other details we need to know about. For example, if you're a no-party affiliation or an NPA, you get to vote in the Democrat primary if you want to, and then also get to vote in the general. If you're an independent candidate, you don't have to go through a primary. You can just file your petitions and be qualified for the general election ballot. Same with libertarian candidates. They are able to nominate candidates similar to how Republicans and Democrats do in the primary to be put on the general election ballot. So these pieces are important to keep in mind as we talk about making a big change like open primaries. So of all these different pieces, this is what it looks like in South Dakota. These numbers are slightly rounded just to make it easier, but 144,000 Democrats, 3,000 Libertarians, 89,000 Independents, 63,000 NPA, no party affiliation, 1,000 other, and 308,000 Republicans. So that's the backdrop of registered voters here in South Dakota that gives us the context for the question of Amendment H, which is what we're going to talk about today, the idea of open primaries in South Dakota. So these people on the right, that is the official committee for Amendment H. It's Joe Kirby, Dee Knudsen, Dre Samuelson, Thomas Dempster, and Tom Heitz. So these are the official committee members who are advocating for Amendment H. They want to do an open primary in South Dakota. And before we talk about pro and con of what that actually is, we need to define what open primary even means. Because, for example, if you start doing research on this, you start reading articles, you'll find statements like this: only 15 states don't have an open primary. At the same time, you'll see only 3 states have open primaries. Those 2 statements conflict. No. Because they keep changing the definition of open primary depending on who's writing the piece. The term open primary has become an umbrella term that could mean a bunch of different things. For example, if you have a Republican primary where the independent or libertarian voters are allowed to vote in the Republican primary to help nominate the Republican nominee, that's sometimes called an open primary. The more accurate way to describe it would be a not fully closed primary. But that's harder to say than just open, so people simplify. So if we go back, instead of saying only 15 states don't have an open primary, the most accurate way to say that would be there are only 15 states where the Republican primary is completely exclusive to Republican voters. There's no exceptions for openings. That's the most accurate way of saying that instead of just calling it open. The other one, only 3 states have open primaries. That's what we're actually going to talk about today, a legitimate open primary. And you'll find the research that says 3, it's actually more like 2.5, and we'll get to that in a minute. Because again, a lot of this gets kind of complicated when you're trying to build all these different structures for elections. So an open primary that we're actually going to be talking about today means everybody, all candidates from all parties, listed on one ballot for all voters. So in the spring, every voter who wants to show up would get a ballot that looks like this, with John Doe and John Smith and Jane Doe and real creative names. And all of the parties you see, the R and the D and the I and the D and the R, everybody's together on one ballot. The top 2 advance to the general for, like, call it a runoff essentially. Or if you're electing 2 representatives to a seat, the top 4. So half the number of candidates advance to the general. Everybody together, and then again everybody together in the general. So here's a description from their website, because we'll start with the pro, the let all voters vote yes on Amendment H message. So we'll start with the descriptions from their website, which is the initiative would establish a top 2 open primary system for the following elections: U.S. Senate, House, governor, state legislature, and county elected offices. In each race, all the candidates would compete in a single primary open to all South Dakota voters. The two candidates that received the most votes would advance to the general election. The ballot would continue to indicate the party affiliation, those little letters beside your name that we saw, or lack thereof for each candidate. And now we'll look into some of their reasoning for why we need this. We should move to this system of having everybody on one ballot for all the voters. They say, we believe that the primary elections in South Dakota should be open to all voters, regardless of political party affiliation. Under our current system, too many South Dakotans are excluded from the primary process.
What a lot.
And some of the media statements that they've said the main argument for this amendment is fairness. All voters should have an equal voice in electing their representatives and leaders. It's from media statements from Mr. Joe Kirby. Now, if you remember back to our 2024 primary, turnout was really low. It was 17%. It's pretty low. So one of the statements we saw from Mr. Kirby, again, some folks like the system that lets 17% of voters decide the outcomes in South Dakota. We don't. Again, this is a lot of their reasoning for why we need open primaries. We can boost those numbers, we can get more people involved in the primary, have more voices involved. He says Iowa and Wyoming all allow independents to vote in either majority primary. And in Minnesota, North Dakota, and Montana, voters don't designate a party when they register. They choose which party primary they want to vote in when they arrive at the polls. Independent voters in all our neighboring states have a meaningful voice in their primary elections, not in South Dakota. So again, you can see what they're trying to go for. They feel that the independent candidates and others don't have a strong enough voice. Remember that structure we saw from the beginning where you can vote in the Democrat if you're an NPA, or if you're Libertarian, you can go to the general. They just believe that people's voices aren't being adequately heard with that current system. Next, we'll go to a few of the endorsements of Amendment H. So here, Senator Michael Roll. As a lifelong Republican, I strongly support open primaries in South Dakota. South Dakota's elections are paid for by all South Dakotans, not the political parties or the elites that run them. All legally registered voters should be eligible to participate in publicly paid for elections affecting their representation in government. While party bosses in the political swamp will campaign against open primaries with misinformation and fear, I proudly stand in support of my neighbors and community because they should decide who represents us. Open primaries returns the power to the people. A couple more endorsements here. Dee Knudsen, remember she's one of the committee members. She said, in recent years, the two-party system has become a driving force behind the troubling level of political division in South Dakota and across the country. This initiative would help address this problem because candidates would no longer face overwhelming pressure to swing to the extremes of the political spectrum in order to win a primary. Here from Janelle Less from Sioux Falls. When I met my husband 33 years ago, we were both very interested in politics, but with very opposing views. We had great conversations about policy questions. Relationships like ours don't flourish anymore in this country because of extreme polarization and a voting system that encourages the divide. I want to live in a country where civil discourse and disagreement is fun again. So this is a lot of their reasonings and their explanations for why we need to let all the voters vote, put everybody together in the same primary with all the candidates, and everybody has, as they say, an equal voice. And it's honestly a really attractive message. If you take it at face value, it's great. Let everybody vote, everybody's equal, and it's all simplified. Instead of that structure, it's really simple. If we look at the other side of this coin, I believe the message of let all voters vote is just the tip of the iceberg. And there's a lot of other things, undercurrents, that we need to know about. So then we'll flip to the other side of the story, the potential negatives, or maybe reasons why we shouldn't. So combining everything together gives us average. You take all the candidates, all the voters, you just average them all out, and that's what each primary election essentially would give you. Rather than the different varying voices, you get an average of all the voices, essentially in each candidate. So if we see this is our breakdown, you average everything out. Do we want candidates that are just, because again, Republican is barely over 50%. So if we just average all of this out, do we want barely Republican candidates? It's a question we have to ask ourselves, because if we're averaging everything out in all of these primaries, is that what we want? And now let's look at the kind of the political breakdown of our legislature. Very crude graph and not to scale, but we've got a few Democrats in the House and the Senate, very clear on their platform, what they stand for, what they believe. And then the Republican Party, you know, we've all talked about the fracturing, and I'm not talking about conflict here as more as just differing ideas. So if you took that left red square, those would be the Republicans that more identify themselves as the moderates or the common sense conservatives. They use a bunch of different labels to describe themselves, but they're slightly more moderate than the other one on the right. And if we're being totally candid, a couple of them kind of agree with the Democrats on a few things, and they're probably not standing fully on the Republican platform. At the same time, if you've got the darker red over there, those are the people who are maybe more willing to fight over the principles and be a little bit more bold about fighting about the details of the platform. But again, we've got to be honest, there's probably a few of them that are maybe starting to agree with the Democrats on a few things. Nobody here's perfect, but you see variety. If you do open primaries, what we would probably see is something closer to this. A lot of candidates in the middle, maybe that barely Republican that we saw, or maybe a moderate Republican, or maybe leans a little bit left, just kind of there in the middle. And then some of the candidates that are they're pretty close to Democrats, and some of them that are, you could maybe call them very conservative, but a lot of averaging out. Which one of these gives you a healthier debate of ideas? Which one of these gives you a broader spectrum of concepts and policies and options for moving forward? I would say the top one gives you a much healthier system. Because again, we're all about the free market, competition, and sometimes that healthy debate is really good. One thing we noticed this year from the far left, some of the Democrats at the state capitol would call themselves slightly more moderate. Some of them, they're proud to call themselves leftists. What we saw from some of them this year was interesting. Instead of taking and introducing legislation that maybe tried to move the needle their direction slightly, they just introduced the legislation that they actually wanted. The full scale, this is what we want. We want to repeal all of your abortion laws. It's actually a healthy debate for us to have. Introduce the bills you want. We'll debate about them from a variety of perspectives rather than just averaging everybody out. Now, if you don't believe me that this is what happened, what would happen, let's look back at some of their comments. Again, we saw this lady here, Dee Knudsen, saying that we would no longer have overwhelming pressure to swing to the extremes of the political spectrum. I don't know about you, but I'm okay with having a variety of all the different opinions represented at the Capitol. They're saying we don't want those two extremes, the left, the right, let's just average things out. And if you still don't believe me, well, we're going here to Joe Kirby. The mainstream Republicans that I would consider myself a part of are seeing growing numbers of election deniers and MAGA people that are getting very aggressive within the party. Now, I'm not sure what to do with this one, because Trump is the nominee, and we're unifying around the nominee, and his campaign is Make America Great Again, so what's a MAGA people? Again, they're trying to throw around labels. So he's saying this group that he sees as a fringe right group needs to be pushed out. At the same time, we would see the Democrats pushed out. We take this from Julia Hellwig, Associate Political Science Professor at USD. She says, if the feeling is that a Republican is going to win anyways, open primaries create a weird incentive for Democrats and Democrat-leaning independents to vote for a moderate Republican, which actually strengthens one-party control. We already know that Democrats are losing ground and have lost financial support in the state, and this could actually make that worse. If we've got majorities like this, should we have it as a goal to have fewer Democrats at the State House? Not necessarily. We've got supermajorities. The Democrats have every right to have their voice heard at the Capitol. You could double the number of Democrats in the House and the Senate. They would maybe have a more cohesive voice. We would still have supermajorities, but we'd maybe have a healthier debate even if you doubled the amount of Democrats. So reducing the number of Democrats is not necessarily a good thing. Their voice isn't being heard. Pushing out what Joe Kirby calls the MAGA people, which, again, I think that's all of us. It pushes out the fringe, either side, what they call fringe, because they want to just average it out. So you see that a lot of the strong conservative voices don't want it. A lot of the Democrats saying, hey, this could actually make it worse. So next, you see that the actual Democrat leaders, the party is neutral, but their top two leaders are against it because they see what it would do to harm their party. Again, what we saw from Julia earlier. So next we go to Senator Wick. He's the top of the Republican Party here in the state. He's supposed to speak and represent the broad spectrum of Republican voices. Because we can all admit that within our Republican Party, within our Republican caucuses at the legislature, there's a broad spectrum of belief and opinion. He's supposed to kind of speak for all of us and not single anyone out. He says, he's opposed to it. He says, find a party you agree with. Find a party that 80% of your values you identify with and join that party. You can't stay independent and tell the parties how to do their jobs. So you've got a lot of different voices from a lot of different perspectives saying, you know what, this is probably not a healthy move for the state. Again, do we want to just average everything out? Now, if you're still wondering, hey, that's not actually what would happen, you're just pontificating, you're just coming up with your theories, let's look at some of the other states. Remember, they said there's 3 states that have open primaries. What happened there? Remember I said it was sort of more like 2.5? We'll start with a half, which is Nebraska. They don't technically have full open primaries, it's more of a nonpartisan general with an almost open primary. Without getting into the details, we'll just leave it at that for now. This is the breakdown of Nebraska voters. See, 47% Republican or lean Republican, 17% in the middle, 36% Democrat or lean Democrat. Now those numbers aren't drastically different than what we see in South Dakota. Remember we said Republican voters were just barely over 50%, and we had a bunch of NPAs and independents, and about a quarter were officially Democrats. So again, not dramatically different numbers. There's some differences, but we're similar. So what are we seeing in Nebraska? Well, I called one of our policy allies down there and chatted with him because he works on a lot of good Republican issues, social values issues, and here's the story he told me. He goes, in Nebraska, he goes, we're really similar to you, maybe one step further towards the Democrats, but just one step. On the life issue, they have to fight like mad to get a bill passed. Even like a pain-capable 20 weeks, or heartbeat, or a 15 weeks, saying, you know what, after 20 weeks, we're not going to kill this kid. They have to fight tooth and nail to get that done, and a lot of times those bills fail. In a state, South Dakota, when it comes to the pro-life issue, we can easily get what we need through the legislature most of the time, right? We have broad Republican support from nearly all the legislators that, you know what, especially late-term abortion or middle, we're not killing kids. In Nebraska, they have to fight tooth and nail and usually can't get the really beneficial legislation done. You take the women's sports issue. Half the country has passed this legislation saying that only females are going to play in female sports. A lot of the national Republican leaders right now, whether that's Governor Nome on the stage, President Trump, Ron DeSantis, you name it, the women's sports issue has, for the country, become kind of a no-brainer, right? It used to be something that they didn't want to necessarily touch, but now it's a slam dunk easy, oh yeah, Republicans, they want us to stand up for biological realities. Nebraska still hasn't passed one. They can't get it through. The populace there is, again, just one step less conservative than South Dakota. And this is what they're seeing. Here's a few things that my friend told me. He goes, this was set up as a way to avoid Washington, D.C. partisanship. What happened was all the candidates moved to the middle. Remember those quotes we saw from people talking about the polarization and the differences, and it's so hard now, and there's the one lady called it the extremes. That's what Nebraska said. You know what, let's stop about these extremes. Let's stop with the partisanship. But everybody eventually just moves to the middle. And if you're just averaging everything out, all the voices aren't necessarily being heard. He went on to say that the Dems wouldn't win a majority, he's talking about South Dakota, if you did this, but they would be able to water down enough districts that they block the good conservative causes. The only thing you would accomplish is watering down the ability for the Republicans to put forward the best candidate. You're inviting Democrats to help pick who the person is. He said, if you guys do this in South Dakota, you will see a more difficult, gridlocked path to passing significant legislation. His prediction after his experience in Nebraska. So if Nebraska is kind of call it a half for oversimplified terms of half open primary, there are only 2 states with legitimate, fully open primaries?
Surprise.
Do I have to explain? I will anyways. I talked with a policy friend in Washington. As I said, what happened in Washington after you guys went to full, legitimate, open primaries? He said it's been horrible. He goes, when you're in a primary, if you want to get, remember the top two concepts, so top two vote getters move on. He goes, if you want to get 2 Republicans out of that primary, you need a 70% turnout of Republican to get 2 candidates. He goes, the numbers are weird. He goes, but you gotta watch the numbers because this is what's happening in Washington. In their top 2 primary, this is what it takes. So if there's a 70% or higher conservative turnout, then those top 2 will be Republicans. If there's anywhere between 51 and 69, you get 1 and 1, a Republican and a Democrat. If you get 50-50, which you'd think would give you a Republican and a Democrat, move on to the general, people get to pick. Even at 50-50, you get 2 Democrats that move on to the primary. That sounds like it wouldn't happen, but that's exactly what's happening in Washington. And one additional thing that he brought up, which I hadn't thought about. How many of you have done phone banking for a Republican candidate? Or gone door-to-door door knocking? Yep, you were handed a list, right? And what did they say when they gave you that list? Probably something like, here's all the Republican voters, or maybe, if they were sophisticated, that here's all the people who voted in 3 out of the last 4 Republican primaries. They're really passionate about standing up for Republican principles. So these are the ones you're calling. So you know I'm calling a good list of people that care. What happens when you move to open primaries is all of your data starts to disappear. He says in Washington, we can't pull a good list of who are our good Republican voters. And again, mentioned on here, it says good conservative turnout. He used that word intentionally. He doesn't know what the Republican turnout was. Your data starts to go away. Your ability to hand a volunteer a list of good, solid Republican voters, hey, give these people a call, let them know about the issue, your data starts to disappear in the long run. He said there's nothing easy about an open primary. Washington used to be a Republican state, and then 2 things happened. Open primaries and mail-in ballots. He said the open primary and the mail-in ballot were the downfall of Washington state. And as he was on the phone with me, he was in the room with the leader of the Republican Party in Washington, and he agreed. So if you go ask our friends in Washington who are trying to get good Republican things done, they'll tell you that open primaries and mail-in ballots were the downfall of Washington state. Do we need to go into the land of fruits and nuts? I think we'll just leave it at let's not copy California. So if you're thinking, okay, maybe it's pretty clear, nobody's going to go for this, Republicans are all going to vote no, and things are going to die, we have to look at the polling. What are South Dakotans thinking right now? Here, this was posted on South Dakota News Watch. Right now, it's 54% support, 32% opposed. A lot of people are liking this idea. And then they do some breakdowns of the differing opinions. So for example, for gender, females, 61.8% support. For guys, only 47% support. For party, this one, there's some interesting things here. For example, Republicans lean opposed. Democrats significantly in favor. Again, their top 2 leaders say don't. The political analysts are saying, actually, it's probably going to make it worse for you. But 82% of them, first blush, like the idea. I would have thought that'd be flipped if they actually knew what's going to happen to their party if this passes. And then look at independent/other. Again, all of their messaging is this allows the independents to have a voice. This allows the others to finally be involved. That's their target. That's who they're fighting for, right? Why isn't that 90-10 support? Why is it only 58%? If this is literally for them. Really intriguing numbers here as we dive into it. Of those who say they support President Trump, because then there was multiple questions in the survey, If you support President Trump, you're 42% likely to support, 44% oppose. Again, just barely lean oppose. If you're a Biden supporter, you're 69% that said, yeah, we support this idea. So that's where South Dakotans are at as of several weeks ago when this polling was done. So let's look back at their messaging. We need to get more voices involved, give people a real voice, and it'll increase voter turnout because more people will have an opportunity. It'll be simpler. Everybody will be together. Because the turnout was so low, 17% shouldn't be deciding what happens. Well, there were a few examples of really high turnout for a Republican primary this year. Let's look at these three counties. 41% in Mitchell because they had a bond issue over Lake Mitchell. 39% and 37% in Gregory and Tripp because there was questions of election integrity also on their primary ballot. Look at the general election turnout. 2016, 70%. 2020, 74%. What do all of these things have in common? People know what's on their ballot and they care. Whether it's Lake Mitchell, which unless you drove past Mitchell right before the election and saw the billboards, none of us would have even known here in Rapid City, but people in Mitchell cared. In these, you've got national candidates that people know and care about. You've got some of our big names on the ballot. So what gets people out to vote? Issues they care about. Making their voice heard on things they care about. Does averaging everything out give people the things that they care about? As we close up here, I want to bring us back to one of Ronald Reagan's speeches. When are we going to get orators like Reagan again? Side question, but I'm looking forward to that day. He goes, there are cynics who say that a party platform is something that no one bothers to read and it doesn't very much often amount to much. I believe the Republican Party has a platform that is a banner of bold, unmistakable colors with no pale pastels. I think right now that's what we have at the Capitol. Remember we had that graph of all the different colors. Whatever a person's belief is, even the different beliefs within our Republican Party, you could say there's a lot of different bold colors within the party. That's what we have right now. And that healthy competition, that healthy debate, is actually what serves the state the best. Sometimes it looks like fighting, but competition can be healthy. Bold colors represent people's voices the best. Now today we've talked about a lot of numbers, statistics, turnouts, ratios, a lot of percentages, but I'll close with this. The best math you can learn is how to calculate the future cost of your current decision. The best math you can learn over all these percentages is calculating the future cost of your current decision. So that's what's before all of South Dakota this fall. What's your decision? Open primaries